In a remote village nestled between two mountain ranges, there was a farmhouse that everyone avoided. For as long as anyone could remember, the farmhouse had been shrouded in mystery, standing abandoned at the end of a dirt road overgrown with weeds. It was said that those who entered the house never returned the same, if they returned at all. The last known inhabitants of the house were the Crowleys, a reclusive family that lived there in the early 1900s. They were a strange bunch, but nothing could have prepared the townspeople for the grisly discovery made by the village's local priest, Father David, one cold November morning. Father David had noticed that no one had seen the Crowley family in weeks. Concerned, he ventured out to the farmhouse, hoping to find them safe and sound. Instead, he found the front door wide open, the house eerily quiet. He cautiously stepped inside, calling out to the family. No one answered. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the shadows seemed unnaturally long. When Father David reached the living room, he froze in horror. The Crowley family was there sitting in a circle around a table, but they were all dead, their faces twisted into grotesque expressions of terror. Each of their eyes was wide open, as though they had seen something unspeakable in their final moments. There was no sign of struggle, no wounds, no blood, just silence. On the table in the center of the room was an old, tattered book. Its pages were filled with symbols Father David did not recognize. But one thing was clear: something terrible had happened here. The townspeople, upon hearing the news, refused to go near the farmhouse. The house was locked up, and for decades it stood abandoned, a decaying relic of something no one wanted to remember. Eventually, it faded from the town's collective memory. Decades later, in the early 2000s, a young couple, Sam and Grace, decided to leave the city and move to the countryside. They wanted a quiet life, a fresh start, and when they saw the farmhouse on sale for dirt cheap, they couldn't believe their luck. The realtor mentioned the house's past in vague terms but assured them it was nothing more than village superstition. They moved in that summer. At first, things were perfect. The house had been renovated inside, and it was even cozier than they had hoped. But it didn't take long for strange things to start happening. At night, Grace would hear footsteps in the hallway, even though Sam was fast asleep beside her. Sometimes, when they were in the kitchen, they would hear soft murmurs, as if someone was whispering just out of earshot. But every time they checked, no one was there. One evening, Sam was out in the barn, and Grace was home alone. She decided to take a bath to relax, but as she soaked in the tub, she heard a faint tapping sound. It was rhythmic, like someone knocking on wood. She called out, thinking it was Sam, but there was no answer. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. Heart racing, she stepped out of the bath, wrapped a towel around herself, and opened the bathroom door. Standing in the hallway was a figure, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and pale skin. His mouth was sewn shut, and his clothes were old, tattered, as though he had been pulled from the earth. Grace gasped, but before she could scream, the man slowly raised a finger to his lips in a gesture for silence. She slammed the door and locked it, her heart pounding. She heard footsteps outside the door, moving away, and the knocking returned, this time from every wall of the house. She crouched down in the bathroom, trying to stay quiet, her body shaking. When Sam came home, Grace was hysterical. She told him what she had seen, but he brushed it off as stress. He didn't believe her, but to ease her mind, he agreed to investigate the house that night. They searched every corner of the farmhouse, nothing. No sign of the man Grace described. But as they were about to go to bed, Sam found something strange. In the attic, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, he discovered the same old book that Father David had found years earlier. The book was ancient, its pages brittle and yellowed. Most of it was written in a language neither of them understood, but there were drawings, disturbing ones, sketches of twisted faces, hands reaching out from the shadows, and a strange symbol repeated on every page. As soon as they found the book, things escalated. The next night, Grace woke up to find Sam standing at the foot of their bed, staring at her. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and he didn't seem to recognize her. She called his name, but he didn't respond. Slowly, he raised his hand and pointed to the doorway. There, standing in the shadows, was the same man Grace had seen in the hallway, the man with the sewn-shut mouth. Before she could scream, Sam collapsed onto the bed, unconscious. When he woke the next morning, he had no memory of what had happened. Determined to find answers, Grace went to the village's small library the next day. She found an old newspaper article about the Crowley family's deaths, and her blood ran cold. The article described the exact same man she had seen, the same sewn-shut mouth, the same hollow eyes. Terrified, Grace and Sam tried to leave the farmhouse, but But every time they attempted to pack their things, something would stop them. Doors would slam shut, their car wouldn't start, or Sam would become strangely entranced, staring at the book for hours on end. Desperate, Grace decided to destroy the book. That night, she took it outside and set it on fire. The flames roared high, and for a moment, she thought she had done it. But as the fire consumed the pages, she heard a low, guttural voice behind her. "You can't leave." She turned around and saw the Crowley family standing in the field, their faces twisted in the same expression of horror they had died with. Behind them was the man with the sewn-shut mouth, watching her silently. Grace backed away, but the figures kept advancing. Suddenly, Sam, who had been inside the house, ran out to her. He grabbed her arm, and together they fled into the woods. They never returned to the farmhouse. The next morning, the townspeople found the house engulfed in flames, reduced to ashes. But even after the fire, some say that on cold, windy nights, if you listen closely near the spot where the house once stood, you can still hear the faint sound of knocking. And if you see a man with his mouth sewn shut, you should run.